So it looks like we have everybody here, and a couple of people are logged in remote. So I would like to call the May 5th, 2020 Board of Selectmen's meeting to order. Can I please have a roll call vote? Or roll call?
Present.
Cortez present.
Al Davis present. Mike Hughes present.
Kevin Morris present. The only announcement that I have is, first of all, happy Cinco de Mayo to people, and a happy birthday to our favorite fire chief, Kent Vincent. So how fortunate to have a birthday on Cinco de Mayo, so he's got an excuse for a few extra beers today. But that's all I have. So we can move right into the first item, which is approved liquor license application for the Beagle Club and change of officers and possible vote. And I don't know if we have anybody from the Beagle on the phone. No, we don't. Looking at the participants, but I'm assuming all their packet don't have any notes on it.
I thought there was an email or a note that I read earlier that we didn't need anyone from the club here to
No.
approve it. No?
Yeah, it says here, no one from the Beagle Club needs to take part. Usually there is someone. So, and I'm assuming as we have a full package in front of us from Suzanne that everything that they need to have is presented to us, so it just requires our vote and signatures.
Mr. Chairman, this is a standard thing we do every year. I move approval.
Second.
I just add for the record that I'm a member of the club.
Okay. So the motion was made by Tim and seconded by, I'm sorry, I didn't catch who seconded it.
Al.
Hal. And Dave, for the record, is a member of the Beagle Club. All those in favor, roll call vote, please.
Bone and I.
Cortez, aye.
Davis, aye. Hughes, aye.
Kevin Morris, aye. So I'll get our signatures, and then we can put them in the office for Suzanne later.
Very good.
All right, our second agenda item is approve road use for the Tri-State Trek, an annual event on 6/19. I guess provided that the pandemic come to an end and then they're allowed to do this by the state. 200 cyclists are planning on traveling through our town on their way from Boston to Greenwich, Connecticut. It's the 18th annual ALS Therapy Development Institute Tri-State Trek. I guess it raises funds, spreading awareness for ALS TDI. So, and they enclose the proposed route. And I see that we do have our police chief on. Have you had a chance to review the route, chief?
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Yes, I am, and I don't have any issues or concerns with it at this time.
Excellent.
Looks like about a 150-mile trek, isn't it, from Boston to Greenwich? Quite
About that.
a ride.
Yeah, that sounds about right.
Bonin, are you going to break your bike out for this if we're allowed to do it?
No,
No?
not this year.
Well, I mean, there's no reason why we can't approve it. And I mean, if the state won't allow events like that, that kind of trumps us anyway. But
I would move that we accept the permit as filed, or the application.
I'll second.
Motion was made by Dave, seconded by Mike. Any further discussion? Seeing as none, can I get a roll call vote, please?
Bone and I.
Cortez, aye.
Davis, aye. Hughes, aye.
Kevin Morris, aye. All right, so that is done. Our next item is to approve the minutes for the April 28th meeting.
Second.
Motion's been made and seconded. Can I get a roll call vote?
Wasting no time. Bone and I.
Cortez, aye.
Davis, aye.
Hughes, aye.
Morris, aye. All right, that was easy. Brings us to the fun stuff, the administrator's report.
Always the best part.
Mr. Chairman, we've got quite a bit of updating to do. First, COVID-19 facts and figures. The source here would be the command center and the governor. Just want to point out, we're always talking about the most grim news or the most pessimistic news. It's important to note that the number of hospitalized patients across the Commonwealth peaked on April 21st with 3,965 people. Today, that number stands at 3,000, well, actually yesterday, the number is 3,542, which is a steady and slight decline in the number of hospitalized COVID-19 patients. This has been a key metric for the governor to determine what his next steps will be. And we are on a positive trend. So irrespective of how many people are getting tested, or how many people are coming back positive after they've been tested, one of the critical objectives of social distancing has been to prevent the healthcare system from being overwhelmed. It was not. It doesn't appear that it will be anytime soon because of this trend. And we will learn, I guess, from other states that are opening a little bit earlier than us, how they fare and whether or not it's wise to go forward with certain forms of loosening. At the same time that all of this is occurring, the public needs to be mindful that the governor has ordered that anybody who is going to go into a space where social distancing is not possible, or where there may be people who, by chance, are going to regularly be within your space, within your 6-foot space, that you must wear a mask. And as the governor has pointed out several times, the mask is not to protect you from other people. It's to protect other people from you. Because masks do a much better job of keeping whatever you sneeze or cough or accidentally spit out as you speak. Keeps that stuff close to your own body and doesn't go towards them. And that is the purpose of that order. There are some communities in Massachusetts that may consider, I've heard of a couple have considered using the governor's authority to bring the fines and fees up to the max $300, civil infraction. We're hoping we don't have to do that. Every time I drive around different places in Douglas where people might be, even folks just walking up and down Main Street have a mask, and when they get close to other people, they're putting it on. Then that's all we'd ask people to do. I expect the Board of Health will appoint the Douglas Police Department to serve as their agents. There are 2 reasons why that may occur, and we consulted at some length with Town Council Richard Bowen this morning. And that is to enforce any quarantine order that may need to be enforced. We still want folks to be mindful of the fact that if they live in a place where they're surrounded by a fairly substantial population of vulnerable people, that they need to exercise extreme care when complying with their quarantine order if they have been exposed to COVID-19 from some other source. And our hope, of course, is that interactions with the town nurse will be positive. There is a testing method to get yourself cleared. It's 2 negative tests with more than 24 hours between those tests. So there's no mystery here. We have an additional positive case this week at Riddlebrook. That's the one place we really want to keep the lid on it. There's another individual who's exposed to the person who tested positive for a lengthy period of time, meets the clinical definition of exposure. And our hope is that in working with this individual, we'll get to a positive outcome. The other thing is the face mask order. We don't really want the Douglas police to become the mask police. We just want to remind people that if they're congregating in large groups and the police ask you to move along, please do so, because the mask thing might be something that we could tack on if you're uncooperative, if you're not wearing a mask. hopefully this will all go away soon, and we won't have this conversation anymore. But that appointment does put the Board of Health in the position to be able to enforce these orders, which is what the position that Town Council advised we put them in. This morning, there was a lengthy conference call between Mr. Cronin, Sean Cronin from the Department of Revenue. It's really kind of in the inside circle with the governor's group. He was involved in municipal finance for a long time. And the members of the small town administrators, the STAM, which is, really communities that are 10,000 and under. We have a number of unique challenges. And I had somebody in my office for the first 30 minutes of the call. I'm going to listen to the rest of it tomorrow morning when it's posted by MMA. But for the last half hour, I was able to listen. And I gathered just from that half hour really important information. Federal CARES Act funds will be distributed to small towns by the state on a formula basis. And they're meant to backstop our fiscal 20 spending. So that the year that we're in, there are 3 criteria for the use of any funding coming from the Federal CARES Act. 1, it cannot be used to cover revenue shortfalls. 2, the spending that it's used to offset must be related to a COVID-19 response activity. And thirdly, the cost must have been unbudgeted as of March 27th. Really, if you meet the second criteria, you probably meet the third. But what Sean did with that is he said that's indicative of what you might want to do for fiscal '21. The current view at DOR in Massachusetts is that CARES Act funding will be acceptable as for use to offset the town's share of any FEMA reimbursable expenses. So right now, we're in a 25-75 split with the feds if the expenses are reimbursable under FEMA's guidelines. The 25% can be, we can meet our 25% because it's an unbudgeted expense with CARES Act funds. That kind of leverages those CARES Act funds out to a larger sum than what they would if they were one for one. They're still going to work on making sure the feds confirm that that's acceptable, but that every indication they have is that it will be. Mr. Cronin's recommendation is not to budget COVID-19 response expenses directly in the fiscal '21 budget. If this is going to be the way they approach aid to municipalities across the country, then don't budget it. And that kind of fits the way we've been doing it. So we've been allocating staff from existing functions, or we have, for instance, for PPE, we've overexpensed that line item. That line item is not broken out in the budget approved by town meeting, so it's all going to be still copacetic within our budget. We may have to do some interdepartmental transfers by the process, but we're within our budget. So at this point, looking to next year, we're going to do the same thing. As long as our bottom line is clean, we're comfortable with what we have set aside. There may be a necessity to put some new funds in civil defense just so that we'd have liquidity in the event that we have another outbreak in the fall or winter. But right now, we're going to follow Mr. Cronin's advice and not directly budget them in the fiscal '21 budget. Towns are also advised, because there's been interaction between Mr. Cronin's office and the rating agencies, so Standard & Poor's and Moody's. Municipalities in Massachusetts will not see a bond rating call if they dip into their stabilization funds to meet. It's a rainy day, guess what? It's pouring.
It's raining.
So it's acceptable. But what you cannot do is willy-nilly kind of stumble into using your stabilization funds. Supermajority notwithstanding, you need to have a plan. Our plan in Douglas, as I started to describe at the last meeting, and Gene and I have been over this a couple times, is spending cuts first. Secondly, use of free cash. Thirdly, and we'll talk about this, any funds that may be reprogrammed and released from a capital spending freeze. And then only at the last resort would we look at stabilization. So there's quite a long way
Right.
to go before we get to stabilization. If you have that plan in place and you follow your plan and you end up hitting stabilization, your bond rating won't be hit, as long as you have a plan to also fund yourself back to emerge from that.
When you stated that the CARES funds couldn't be used to cover a budget shortfall, just for clarity. say-
Revenue shortfall.
A revenue shortfall, okay. So that if we have an overrun or a shortfall, obviously, in the overtime department, public safety, there's no problem using them to
No
cover
problem
that?
using it.
Okay, good, thank you.
What they don't want you to do is say, oh my gosh, we have this huge revenue shortfall because some item didn't materialize that we
Right.
expected. If we had been more reliant on a cannabis host agreement and didn't,
Right.
you can't plug the hole because that happened if you didn't spend on anything on the.
Plug a spending hole, but not a revenue hole.
Right.
Yes.
So that was what I got from the last 30 minutes. Tim?
Sorry, I didn't put you on the spot, but the status of our stabilization account currently, do you have ballpark number of where we are in relation to what MMA says we should have?
Well, it's not what MMA says we should have, it's the rating agencies. We meet the thresholds.
Right.
I think we're at 3%. And don't quote me on it, but I think it's just a little bit bigger than our certified free cash, if I'm not mistaken.
I don't remember the
I
amount.
mean, that was, the idea was to grow it so that it exceeded, grow free cash so that it exceeded stabilization, then put it over. You are putting me on the spot. That's a question for Gene, because I'd rather give you a precise figure than estimate. We have, at the last ratings call, we were over their threshold, their baseline threshold for the rating that we have. And I don't look at stabilization because I never intend to ask anybody to spend it, so.
Me either.
Yeah, right. The budget changes, last time we discussed revenue, I put all those revenue changes into the spreadsheet model, and I can give you exact figures here. Adopting that aggressive revenue forecast from the last meeting would yield a budget deficit in fiscal '21 of $657,075. So that revenue change of 923 and change only yields a $657,000 shortfall because we had a budget surplus as of the last budget submission or the last numbers I was able to plug in. Now, that includes a really big increase in property and casualty insurance, offset by a very flat line for health insurance resulting from the self-insurance scheme. So that, what would we do? Low-hanging fruit, the things that everybody always does, they look to the COLA first. If we took the non-union employees and gave them a 0% COLA, that would bring the deficit down to $619,087. If we invite the unions, our union represented employees to also join in that, it would get us to $602,841. At that point, I'm not real wild about looking at the municipal side as being where we get savings. Because at a 0% COLA for all employees, that means that year over year spending on the municipal side of the budget will be 1.4% on revenue increases that typically pace at 1.7. So at that point, what I would do, and what I am open-minded to do, is reorganizations. I'm missing some numbers I need to actually plug those things in. Mindful of the fact that if we do reorganizations that have long-term savings for the town, they would not have savings in fiscal '21 because they're probably associated with technology spending. And, you know, some people don't like the situation, they might leave and we'd have to rehire. There might be some situations there that cost us some money. So I wouldn't count the savings in fiscal '21, but I would count them in fiscal '22.
Restructure is usually going to be a wash year one.
It's, yeah, and.
At least year one.
Especially with technology solutions, but those technology solutions have the benefit of making town hall more and more virtual and meeting the basic threshold requirements for continuity of operations in the case of any kind of disaster. or inability of the town hall to function in its building. It would still function in the cloud. Right now, we've been able to operate our building office and our planning office and our conservation office without having to be open to the public. When there's an appointment made and an application is submitted, we're able to take it in. And right now, we actually had one of the best months this past April in terms of revenues from building permits that we've ever had for building permit revenues. Part of that's, you remember that the schedule of fees was adjusted. So there's been some increase there, but it's really being driven by volume. People are getting their work done. And so for that, in that way, the town has closed to the public, but we haven't closed the business. That's the idea of having an electronic town hall. You fill in all the applications online, submit your fee, and the town gets the revenue it needs, but more importantly, we have the information we need to allow you to proceed forward with your work. So the people who are doing the work get paid as well. That's part of what I'm thinking of a potential reorganization would be around that kind of platform, electronic permitting and other things associated with it. But the next place I would look is to take local support for education, pretty close to net school spend, which right now I'm estimating at a 1% year-over-year increase instead of a 2%. And that would take the deficit down to $466,942. I've been operating under the assumption that if we can get the projected deficit under $500,000, we would use free cash at that point to try to bridge us. It violates a fundamental principle in good times, but in bad times, that's what free cash is for. It's to allow services to continue uninterrupted without making such deep cuts to them that you can't rejuvenate them when you emerge. At 500,000 on a balance of just about 1.5 million, a little bit under 1.5 million, we might have the energy to get through a couple of years of downturn. ICMA did a survey. What are the two models that most town managers across the entire country are using right now? A V-shaped economic recovery and an L-shaped. When I filled out the survey, I said L-shaped.
Yeah.
And so our 5-year budget projection does not include any revenue recovery from the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So in year 5, it gets grim. It's just an awfully big number. But there's no new growth factored in over a really small number. So hopefully, we would still be able to have some form of new growth refueling the tax base every year so that we could kind of muddle our way through that.
Do these figures that we're talking about now include any use of those CARES funds?
No.
So that would be an additional for us, right?
FEMA reimbursements and CARES funds would be basically cover what we've already funded, so they would actually return back.
Right.
Does-
Close to the general fund of free cash.
Did you model at a level fund over to the district, as opposed to 1%, just a flat level funding?
So I know where it got us. It got us from 602 to 466, right? So what is that, 156,000 for every 1% you take down. So you take another 156, you're at 310. At zero.
Much more manageable number.
Yeah. So that's where I'm at with the budget planning. I know where the finance director is coming from in terms of whether you do a month-over-month budget or you do an annual budget. If you don't have town meeting, you technically are spending without a vote on raise and appropriate. I get that. I mean, that's the law. That's Massachusetts. My prediction is that what DOR and the governor and the legislature are working on is understanding that and giving the municipalities the authority to raise and appropriate the funds it needs on a month-to-month basis or on some annualized basis, and then budget month-to-month expenses accordingly. I don't think they're gonna tell us to do things that fly in the face of their own law without changing the law. Because it might just be very difficult to, just technically, so we're still planning on a late June, and we'll have a recommendation for the board and for FinCom for a late June town meeting that is a real town meeting with financial articles, and so that we can raise and appropriate. And at that point, that would be an annual budget. If failing that, what I will do is write an annual budget and then do a month-to-month implementation of that bare bones budget, so that the two are one and the same, and we're not working at cross purposes with ourselves. I'm just not real optimistic. Now, the governor's order said that municipal town meetings are exempt from the limit on the number of people who can assemble in a place. It may be lawful, I don't know that it would be wise, because we've basically said no to virtually every other kind of meeting, including religious meetings, where people think that they're, tending to the health of their souls, but we're gonna let town meeting go forward and schedule that and have people. To me, that just seems to be working at strange cross purposes. I also don't like the idea of any one person, who might want to attend town meeting, because they've always attended, who has a healthcare vulnerability, staying home because their town went forward with a town meeting, and I've got very specific people in mind that I know have different conditions, because they've told me that they struggle sometimes to breathe, or they have allergies or whatever, and they can't come to a meeting because we've scheduled it at a time when they're feeling very vulnerable and the virus is spreading on a community basis.
It defeats the purpose, because you should be there or not be there, not under duress.
Exactly, and so that's why there's more dimensions to this than just complying with the checklist of the steps to have a municipal budget every year. So I'm still kind of stuck on why would we push that. One thing I will say, if we do seem to be on track to get it done at the end of June, and we're going to try to do a certain amount of social distancing, we're going to have to get an early start on the technical side of it. So if we're going to have one room and overflow rooms, and maybe we'll borrow somebody's electronic voting format, it all has to be set up as if we're going to have a big turnout. And if we get only 20 or 30, then too bad. But we've got to make sure it works. I think, from my experience here, the last couple of years, when we've done overflow rooms, or we've had big turnout, especially when the override question was being debated, the technical stuff started to get in the way, because it was all done at the last minute, and I'm not for that. So just a little bit of shout out to Douglas Gable and to everybody else who helps us at the school department. If we are on track to try to pull off a town meeting at the end of June, we're gonna be testing that thing for a couple of days and put it through its paces to make sure it works, so that people aren't disenfranchised in a different way at an open meeting. Having said all of that, there are some things that are going forward because the judgment of the town was that they could occur. There is still an election on May 12th. The polls will be open for 4 hours in the afternoon, 4 to 8. Voters are still encouraged to use mail ballots, absentee ballots. The applications are on the door at Town Hall, and they will be available up till noon on May 11th. Other changes that we've made at Municipal Center, eventually we will reopen. Plexiglass protection has been put in all public-facing areas, so town clerk, tax collector, building office, assessor's office, Board of Health, they're all divided now from the public. We have plexiglass shield that you've seen in place in a lot of different businesses. So looking forward to May 12th, Mr. Chairman, I got 3 requests for your agenda. One would be consideration and vote on sending a request to our bargaining units to reopen their contract. Secondly, because that's a town contract that was ratified by a town meeting, I think the selectmen have the ability to ask for a reopener. And that may set off a whole chain of things. We may have to do a 3-year if we do reopen on 1 year. It might make more sense to do that. It depends on how the units react. Second, consideration and vote on a capital spending freeze, which I don't think I have the authority to do on my own. I can recommend it. And lastly, consideration and vote on the rank ordering of the sources of funding, that plan that we talked about the bond agencies wanting to see. So all 3 of those things will have to be on your May 12th agenda. And we'll work with town council to make sure that that's all in place. And lastly, I have a certificate of service. We did get our letter to Resonate finally. but it was on May 1st. The good news is the security there is so good that even the postman couldn't get through with a letter from the town, whether certified or not. So our poor constable has struggled, but he got through in 2 o'clock in the afternoon on May 1st. So we'll let the clock tick for a little while before. But remember, there is an invitation in that letter to have a discussion about how this shutdown has affected their business and what they see happening going forward. That's my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. So we'll definitely put those 3 things on the next agenda moving forward, because, I mean, the faster we can work on that, the better off we'll be. As far as the COVID stuff, I feel pretty confident that we'll be probably struggling with this again in the fall.
That's what everybody's saying, and
Doom and gloom, both of you.
Huh?
Doom and gloom.
Well, I would rather err on the side of caution. I mean, my point on it is that Matt and the EOC staff and our department heads and chiefs and section chiefs that have been running through it, if we are forced to go down this road again, there's a fantastic plan that's currently sitting in place. I couldn't be more pleased with the way the meals program, once everything got out of the way, that started working. How smoothly the EOC is running, with the exception of the EOC telephone. Stupid Avaya. I'll get that rectified eventually, so that way we'll have a permanent one. But, no, I mean, I think that we've at least got a good footing. When you talked about budget with civil defense, I mean, not trying to go too deep into budgetary discussions, is to look at whatever our spend was between now and when the state of emergency is lifted and say that's our civil defense budget, because it's a good place to start. Or at least some fraction thereof, because it would be easier to do a fund transfer from civil defense to whatever we need to do in the event that we're, again, locked out of another town meeting and, perpetuating the cycle.
yeah, so everybody understands there's a lot of layers to the onion.
Yep.
So we wait for the camera to make its way over. It's not
Can't-
you, it's the camera.
Yeah.
It only goes so fast.
Again, stupid Avaya.
No, really, if it went too fast, everybody would get motion sick. We've scored to our COVID tracking every single expense. So whether it's my time, or Gene's time, or Janice's time, we're on the regular payroll, but we've said with allocation, just so we know in our minds how much effort we put into it and how to score that. Some of that stuff will not be reimbursable, and because it's not outside of the budget and it's part of somebody's regular job description, even the CARES Act can't be used to cover it. So there's probably this big circle, right? The big circle is what the budget has already in it. A smaller circle would be what's CARES Act eligible, and even smaller circle still would be what is FEMA eligible. And so all 3 of those things, we're trying to track all 3 of those things simultaneously to make sure the right funding source gets used. We're estimating that we've probably spent about, on that big circle, I just hit my microphone, on the big circle it's about $70,000 wide. But when you offset what was already in our budget, it's a much smaller number that we've spent outside, and Gene's been going through the different accounts and asking different departments and boards and commissions to, part with some of their budget. We're almost at the end of the year to just cover it within our existing budget. So that's where we stand. So the thing is, so following Mr. Cronin's advice, what would we not want in the civil defense line?
Anything that's not,
Anything that's not CARES reimbursable needs to stay in the main budget.
yeah.
So the civil defense line would have to be. Even, I'm just trying to go through so by far the biggest driver of expense was the cost of staffing a second ambulance 24/7. Because that's people, and that's always going to be our main expense. We've covered an awful lot of that, if not all of it, with the existing budget for call firefighters within the fire department's budget. we typically see that turned back. And yet we budget a certain amount every year because we don't know how many fires there are going to be. We have a rough estimate of how many hours we might ask them to work in a regular year and how busy they're going to be. And it doesn't always materialize. So sometimes it's a turn back, sometimes it breaks even. So this year so far, they just haven't been to many fires, but they've been staffed in that ambulance. So that's how we were able to skate on it this year. Sorry to interrupt, but.
No, you're not interrupting at all. So, I mean, it's good information to have. I'm glad that we managed to get the override through and put the budget that we put in, because I would shudder to think of where we would be
Right.
with a situation like this coming through, had that override passed.
Not to put an overly emphatic point on it, but it is a reality that even with, as you recall, even with the aggressive budget reduction numbers that were the alternative, so the non-override budget, closing the library, you still would have had a very significant reliance upon free cash just for operations. So it would not be available to bridge any revenue drop-off from the state. So you, at this point, would be looking at massive service reductions, probably losing 24/7 coverage at the fire department for sure, and significant, furloughing almost everybody, and not having community support programs to try to, the whole idea of the community support programs is there's economic distress, yes, but we also don't want vulnerable people going out and getting themselves exposed to the virus. So trying to keep people safe. None of that would be possible. And you probably would be talking about, for this July coming, a liquidity crunch
Yeah.
of considerable magnitude. Because assuming that you would not have been able to stop the property and casualty claims, and you probably would not have had, again, going back to health insurance, the town needed to be flexible enough in its budget and have enough liquid assets available to fund the equity in the trust fund to go self-insured and enjoy these last 2 years, a 1.4% increase and a 2% precautionary. So the underwriters only scored us at a 2% because we still don't have enough claims experience as a self-insured entity to exactly know. But if you were looking at our actual claims history, we should be at a 0. If we were still in the fully insured market and those were 10 and 11% increases year over year, which is what we were looking at, you just wouldn't be able to pay the bills. It's not a funny joke. I mean, there's only so many things that can flow into a municipal budget, and if they're insufficient, then you take a shock, you're left with very little. I'm curious to see how my hometown's gonna do, because they have so much free cash in the budget, it's scary. I just don't know what they're gonna do.
All right. Well, is there any other open session topics not reasonably anticipated 48 hours in advance of our meeting? I think that kind of sums up old business and new business. All right. Anybody have anything else at all?
So to clarify, May 12th, we're going to make a decision on whether or not we're going to move ahead with a June annual town meeting financial only or not.
Yeah, Tim, I thought we were going to discuss that with FinCom again at our next joint meeting.
Right.
And then try and get some additional guidance as to what's really been opened up according to the state. So I don't know if that'll be our final determination, but I think we'll have a little bit clearer of a picture to be able to make a better educated guess. I think that's, not trying to sound too vague.
Yeah, that's the 19th, not the 12th.
Yeah, and that meeting's on the 19th.
Okay, good.
Anything else? Seeing as none, I would entertain a motion for adjournment.
So moved.
Anybody can?
Second.
Look at that. Motion's been made and seconded. Can I get a roll call vote, please?
Bone and I.
Dave Cortez, aye.
I think Hal is muted.
Now,
All right, he says Hal Davis, aye, according to reading lips.
Mike Hughes, aye.
Kevin Morris, aye. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Have a good night.